Hi everybody, it's Easter and we welcome you to our celebration and also to our reflection. Each year Easter comes round like Christmas, and each year we wonder, how do we make it fresh, how do we make it new, how do we not get into a familiar rut where we just know it and it loses its power over us, it loses its potential to awaken us and to remind us of why it's there and why we celebrate it. These celebrations are important, even personal ones like birthdays, anniversaries. They're important because we remember the bigger story, we remember the bigger picture. And with Easter we remember a profound event in history where Jesus was crucified, where Jesus rose from the dead, and where the culmination of the whole Christian story, where his work on earth was done. And that work was really to transform our lives, to transform the reality of the world in everyone's relationship with God. Before that, the law had controlled everything that was done, and whatever denomination or whatever religion you were in, there was a law which controlled your behavior. Jesus came to fulfill the requirements of those laws, that law particularly, and he came to give us a new law or a new dispensation or a new experience of life in him. And so his life and teaching are really what we continuously draw on to live a spiritual life which is new and relevant and very important in our current day and life experience. So Easter is the time of transformation. However much it's familiar and well known, we need to each year go deeper into its meaning and into its relevance for us. And this particular year I'd like us to reflect on Jesus' statements, because we normally reflect on the cross, on Jesus' sayings on the cross and the whole crucifixion experience. But I'd like us to reflect on Jesus' statement that we need to die. He says, if you die with me, you will rise again with me. And dying with him, it's a bit not an easy to understand phrase, but it's important to reflect on it because it's a very powerful phrase. And however much it's not a nice phrase, dying doesn't warm us and draw us. But what he's really saying is that we need to die to something so that we can live to something. We need to let go of something so that we can actually take on something. So it's not a dying in the sense of ceasing to exist. It's a dying to let go of that which prevents us from truly existing, from truly coming alive, from truly becoming the person that he's made us to be. And so as we reflect on Easter and what it means to die with Jesus, we need fresh eyes and fresh ears and a fresh sense like a child that is always present and fully open, so that we can begin to realize the importance of what it is that Jesus calls us into, and how we actually move into that life, into that reality where we live a different life, where we don't live an old life, where that life is, we shed it like a skin that doesn't fit anymore. We live a new life, because a new life is profoundly rooted in a spiritual inner dimension. When Nicodemus came to Jesus, Jesus said, you need to be born again. And he was puzzled. What do you mean by that? He said, you need to be born of the Spirit. Flesh gives life to life, but Spirit gives life to spirit. And so we need to understand that to be in Christ, to be living with Christ and working and doing the works that Jesus has called us to do, means to be spiritually alive and spiritually sensitive. And so the elements we're going to be looking at are very simple, very familiar, but when Jesus used them, he gave profound significance to them. And there are many, but I've chosen 5, and they're very familiar. When Jesus said, you are the light of the world, he said, you are the salt of the earth. He said, you are the carriers, the bearers of living water, water that will enable us never to thirst again. He says that we are representative of bread that is living bread. And he says that we are the best wine. And he uses wine as a picture of us becoming special and set aside for him. So we're going to use those 5 elements, and I'd like you to go through each of the 5 sections in your own time. We'll do a short input on each, and then afterwards maybe you can just take a break and spend a few minutes, maybe longer, half an hour, just reflecting on what that particular analogy means for you, and how it touches you, and how you're invited to receive it, but also to give it out, because all these elements are for our transformation, but it doesn't end with us. It's for to go through us for the transformation of the world, for the healing of the world. And by world I mean our world, or the bigger world, whatever world we affect. May that be affected by what's happened to us. So Jesus calls us to partner with him in giving life to the world. And so it's important that we take it seriously, and we spend some time reflecting on it and really getting into it, and then putting some things in place, getting some action, some decision, some choice, or some realization that this actually will become a part of our lived experience, part of our lived life, part of the life we live in the context that we live every day, our work, our home, our families, wherever, our friends, whatever activities we're part of, that we bring that element as an experiential reality in our lives to that space. So I wish you well, and I wish you a good reflection as you meditate on this Easter celebration, and take your time to go through the 5 different elements, do your journaling, do your thinking and reflecting and deciding. You can have coffee or tea in between. They're basically 5 elements and the introduction, which you've just seen now, which is 6. We'll stop. The first video will go from 1 to 3, and then 4, 5 and 6 will be the second video. And as you know, we've sent this out on Friday at 12 o'clock, and this will be then available for you, and you can do it any time over the weekend or later if you want. Come back to it if you wish. So we wish you well, and this is the end of the introduction, and after a few moments we'll start with part 1, which is You Are the Light of the World. Thank you. Good, well, welcome back on this day, and our first part is on a familiar saying where Jesus says, you are the light of the world. If we think about it, it's just a profound comment or a profound statement that you and I are the light of the world. And it's important to reflect on what it really means, because it's such a profound statement, it's such a big statement, that we can't just say, oh yes, we know that, and then go on with our lives as if nothing was different. In saying this, Jesus obviously is not saying that we are the source of the light, but he is the source of the light, but we are the lens, we are the means by which that light comes into the world. And I'd like to read from the first Gospel of John, John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men and women. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. So light and darkness go together. We know that we're very familiar with light. Light is a very common, familiar image, metaphor. And yet Jesus uses it now to describe light and darkness as the spiritual state of the world we're living in. And he describes himself as the light coming into the world, and the light then shining in the darkness. But as we hear from this passage, darkness hasn't understood the light, and darkness hasn't always received the light. It doesn't take much light to push away the darkness and to light up a room. So as we reflect on light and what it means to be light, it's good to realize that we don't have to do it in our own strength. This is not about us pumping ourselves up and being something we're not. But this is really understanding that Jesus is the light, and his light reflects on us, reflects through us. And as I said just now, we're the lens through which the beauty of Jesus shines in a dark world. And in Matthew 5 he says, you're the light of the world. A light cannot be hidden. A city is on a hill and it can't be hidden, and people don't light a light and put it under a bucket. A light needs to be seen, otherwise it doesn't make any sense to have a light. And so as we are spiritual light, as we reflect spiritual light, we need to be in the world and reflecting that light in a dark world, so that the light actually reaches its destination, its chosen destination. Jesus wants us to be light in a world which is needing light. And it's not about being perfect, as I said, or being somehow the source, but it's really how, when we live an authentic life, soaked in who Jesus is for us, that light begins to shine through us and shine out of us. It's not that we become proud or arrogant or somehow full of ourselves, but that in humility we are aware that Jesus is the one who gives us life, and as his life and light shines in us or shines through us, so that life comes out to others. As Leonard Cohen says in his song, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And even in our cracked and humble lives, the light of Jesus shines through the cracks and creates hope and light for the world around us. I'd like to read from 1 John 1 verse 5. This is the message that we have heard from him and declare to you. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and walk in the darkness, we do not live by the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, purifies from all sin. So walking in the light is really about seeing where we're walking. If we walk in darkness, you stumble and you fall. Walking in the light, you're able to see where you're going. And so it's not about somehow feeling that we have to be adequate or perfect, but really that in our own experience, that light has brought life to us, and that life then shines through us and creates a space where in our relationships, in our connection with people, in our work situations, we bring light, we bring an acceptance, we bring a respect for the other as we respect ourselves, we bring Christ's love, which is a different kind of love. It's not a love that depends on people being likable, but it's a love that gives them hope and that gives them possibility. The world is desperate for truth and reality, and when Jesus encourages us to be like the light, to be the light, he's wanting us to bring a sense of reality, a sense of hope, a sense of depth, a sense of authenticity in a world which is really desperate for true life, for authentic life, for abundant life. One can't live life in darkness. One can't thrive and achieve much in darkness. One can't even see in the darkness. And that's why so many people are lost and really don't know the way. And when he encourages us to be the light, he calls us to follow him and to allow his light to shine through us into a world that really needs a lot of direction and a lot of affirmation and a lot of reality, and that needs to be in loving relationship. So we'll stop there with light, take a break, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and look at you are the salt of the earth. The second element we're looking at today is salt. And again, salt is a very familiar element. It's something that is part of our everyday lives. It's relatively cheap, it's easily available, and it's in everything. All food has got salt of some sort or other. And maybe it wasn't always like that, because salt used to be a luxury. People had to go far and wide to get salt. Sometimes there were wars fought over salt. I know in the Caribbean there's an island, Aruba, which was the salt island, and different countries fought over that island because it was the source of a lot of salt. But generally speaking, salt is readily available, and when Jesus says, "You and I are the salt of the earth," it really should make us stand up and say, wow, what does he mean? It's such a familiar image that we almost take it for granted, almost like it's almost passé. It's hardly, it's very easy to stop seeing it. And so we really need to help ourselves by looking at it and saying, what does this really mean? And how does it become something that is meaningful to me rather than something that is, can become meaningless? Because if it is such an important thing, it really needs to be held as important. In Matthew 5, Jesus, on the Sermon on the Mount, one of his first comments, after the Beatitudes, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled by men and women, trampled underfoot. So salt being uniform and being universal is a very understated element. It's very common, as I've said, but some of the elements that come out of it are profound. Salt is extremely important. We can't live without it. Even though it's a humble element, we can't live without it because our body needs it for its function. Without salt we get sick very quickly and we die. So salt is very necessary because the elements of salt are necessary for the chemical interactions in our body and the electrical interactions. So our nerves wouldn't work. A lot of our processes, internal metabolism and processes wouldn't work without salt. So salt has that enormously important function in our body, which is largely unseen. When we have salt, we forget that we need it and things are going fine. But salt primarily we experience in food. We all have salt cellars on our table and salt cellars next to the stove, and when we're cooking we use salt. And salt really brings out the flavor. It brings out the flavor in food, that seasons food. And that's why how our body communicates with us that we need salt. It makes the food, food without salt is tasteless, and salt immediately increases the flavor and the taste. And in our mouths, salt really brings out the flavor. And so that's how our body communicates with us. When it needs more salt, it actually makes us desire that flavor, that connection. And so it's very much part of our experience of eating. And salt also symbolizes other things, because salt purifies food. Food that is kept for periods of time is salted, and that keeps it from going off, from spoiling. And we all know, biltong, salted foods, salted meat. In the old days, when there weren't many, when refrigeration wasn't common, people would salt food and keep it in salt. I know Italians, with lots of Italian cold meats, prosciutto and salami and things are steeped in sea salt to purify, to preserve them and to make them flavory. Salt also is symbolic of being set apart, because salt has only one function, and that is to be salt. When Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," with that he says the corollary: if salt loses its flavor, if salt loses its function, if salt can't be salt, loses its saltiness, it is good for nothing, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. So salt has got a special function, and it's only one function. And so when we are called salt, and when we're told that we are the salt of the earth, we need to realize that Jesus is calling us into a special and unique function. There's no plan B for salt. And there's no plan B for us. God calls us to be what He has planned for us to be. When He created us to be. And that is the one thing that we need to be. If we try to be something else, we basically lose our saltiness, we lose our function, we lose our primary purpose, and we too easily then find ourselves adrift and becoming meaningless and becoming disconnected from our true purpose in life. And so salt is really to set apart, to make holy. Holy means to be set apart for a special function. And salt is that. It's a substance set apart for a special function, and it doesn't fulfill any other function other than that. So in reflecting on salt, let us remember that salt really gives life, and salt sustains and maintains life, and salt gives beauty and taste and flavor to life, and salt purifies life. It keeps out the infection, it keeps out that which is not appropriate. And then lastly, I want to talk about salt as being a balancing agent. We all know how too little salt, or if we've spoken about salt, too little salt being inadequate. We need enough salt to live, but the other extreme is also a lesson to be noticed, that too much salt spoils. And we all know that you can't drink seawater because it's too salty. We all know that if there's too much salt in food, it becomes impossible to eat. And so salt also symbolizes a balance in life, and a balance means that our external everyday life needs to be balanced with our inner spiritual life, and our spiritual inner life needs to balance our everyday life. So there's that balance between the too little spiritual life, and we wane and we go off. But too much spiritual life, not that there can be too much, but when we overdo certain aspects of our spiritual life, we can become too heavy or too dogmatic or overbearing, and we can become toxic. The story of Lot and his wife, and being told not to look back at Sodom when they were leaving, and she took a peek and became a pillar of salt. When we try to be that which we are not meant to be, we can become overbearing and toxic. And so salt has a very subtle but very profound influence on our lives, and the implications of being called salt and being asked to be salt is an enormous privilege and an enormously fulfilling function that we play in the world, that we are that which gives flavor, which gives life, which preserves, which reminds, which creates balance, and which brings that holy into the everyday. A verse that talks about salt is from Colossians 4:6. It says, "Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt." Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Let your speech always be seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to respond, how to speak to each person. So take a break and reflect on salt and what it means to be salt, and what you're called to be as the salt of your world, of your earth, of the context that you are part of, and how that will be lived out in your life. Thank you.